The smell of roasted garlic always makes me think of the night my life fractured. Not a dramatic Hollywood shattering, just the quiet, pathetic kind where your sister wears your engagement ring and you pretend the Cabernet doesn't taste like battery acid. But vindication? That's a very slow burn. If you're waiting for the part where I caught them tangled in my Egyptian cotton sheets, screaming betrayals while a thunderstorm raged outside, you're in the wrong place. Heartbreak rarely has the budget for good lighting. It usually happens on a random Tuesday, smelling of damp coats and cheap coffee. Liam and I had been together for 4 years, engaged for 8 months. We were comfortable. In that dull, heavily upholstered way a worn-in sofa is comfortable. You stop noticing the sagging springs because you've learned exactly how to sit to avoid them. I ignored his habit of deferring every difficult choice to me. He ignored my tendency to micromanage his finances so we wouldn't drown in takeout debt. We called it balance. Then came a sleety afternoon in November. I'd left my office early because of a migraine, the kind that pulses right behind your left eye and makes the world look overexposed. I didn't text Liam. I just wanted to crawl into the dark of our shared apartment, press a cold washcloth to my face, and sleep. When I pushed the front door open, it stuck on the weather stripping the way it always did. The apartment was quiet, save for the rhythmic, metallic clanking of our ancient radiator. But the air was heavy. It smelled distinctly of Liam's cedarwood body wash, layered sickeningly with something sweet. Vanilla. Specifically, the cloying synthetic vanilla of my younger sister's favorite perfume. Gemma didn't just wear perfume. She weaponized it. She believed her scent should announce her arrival and linger like a threat long after she'd left. I didn't yell. I took my boots off, my wet socks sticking to the warped linoleum in the hallway. I heard a low murmur coming from the kitchen. I crept down the short hall, the migraine suddenly forgotten, replaced by a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline right in the center of my chest. My palms were sweating. I felt like an intruder in my own home. Through the crack in the doorframe, I saw them. They weren't kissing. They weren't tearing each other's clothes off. Honestly, that might have been easier to stomach. It was worse. They were sitting at the tiny, wobbly IKEA kitchen table I had put together by myself. Liam was tracing the rim of a coffee mug with his thumb. Gemma was leaning in, her hand resting over his. "You have to tell her," Gemma said. Her voice wasn't her usual loud, center of attention bray. It was soft, intimate. It made my stomach heave. "I can't keep doing this, Liam. Playing the supportive bridesmaid. Looking at dresses with her when I know you were in my bed last night." Liam ran a hand through his hair, looking trapped, looking weak. "I know, Gem, I know. It's just, the deposits are paid. Her parents are so excited. Harper is going to lose her mind." He didn't sound like a man torn by a grand, forbidden passion. He sounded like a coward annoyed by an administrative error. I didn't burst in. I didn't throw the ceramic bowl of lemons at their heads. The truth is, my reaction was entirely, pathetically human. I froze. My throat closed up, tasting of copper and bile. I backed away, step by agonizing step, grabbed my keys, and left. I made it exactly 3 blocks in my Honda Civic before I had to pull over into a strip mall parking lot. I leaned over the steering wheel and dry heaved into a discarded Wendy's cup. I sobbed until my face was swollen and slick with snot. It wasn't beautiful grief. It was the ugly, hyperventilating kind that leaves your chest bruised. The fallout was a masterclass in familial dysfunction. When I finally confronted Liam that night, he crumbled instantly. He cried more than I did, begging for forgiveness, then immediately shifting the blame to the uncontrollable connection he and Gemma shared. When I called my parents, expecting a fortress of support, I received a polite, uncomfortable negotiation. "Harper, honey, you know how Gemma is." My mother had sighed into the receiver, the sound of the television murmuring in her background. "She's always been impulsive. And Liam, well, maybe you two were just too different. We don't want to tear the family apart over this. You're the strong one. You'll bounce back. You're the strong one." The universal translation for, "You are less of a liability, so we expect you to eat the pain." I moved out that weekend. I spent the next year being a bitter, insufferable cliché. I drank too much Pinot Grigio on weeknights. I bored my remaining friends to tears, dissecting every memory of Liam and Gemma to find the exact moment the rot set in. I obsessed over Gemma's social media, torturing myself with photos of them on trips I was supposed to take, living the life I had budgeted for. They got married 2 years later. I didn't go. My mother sent me a slice of wedding cake in a Tupperware container. I threw it in the trash, but not before noticing the frosting had already started to separate, weeping sugary water into the plastic corners. 9 years is a long time, but it's also no time at all. Cells regenerate, leases expire, wrinkles form, but the muscle memory of betrayal is remarkably stubborn. I survived my 20s. I crawled out of the crater my sister and my ex-fiancé left behind, and I built something solid. I stopped drinking cheap wine. I changed careers, and eventually, I met David. David was a restoration carpenter. He spent his days in a workshop smelling of sawdust, linseed oil, and quiet purpose. He didn't have Liam's slick charm or his desperate need to be liked by everyone in the room. David was grounded. He watched more than he spoke. When he did speak, you knew he meant it. He handled me the way he handled his antique sideboards, aware of the previous damage, careful with the joints, but confident in the foundation. We had been together for 3 years when my parents' 40th wedding anniversary rolled around. The dinner was held at Times Laura, one of those aggressively modern restaurants downtown, where the lighting is so dim you have to use your phone's flashlight to read the menu, and everything smells vaguely of burnt rosemary and truffle oil. My parents sat at the head of the long oak table, looking strained but determined to project the image of a successful matriarchy. David sat beside me, his large, calloused hand resting warm and heavy on my thigh under the table. We were 30 minutes into the reservation when Gemma and Liam finally arrived. Gemma always entered a room like she was late for a press conference. She was draped in a silk blouse that screamed, "maxed out credit card," her wrists clanking with gold bracelets. Liam trailed behind her. Seeing him after so long was jarring, mostly because of how aggressively unremarkable he looked. The shiny veneer of his 20s had completely worn off. His hairline was making a strategic retreat, and he carried a soft, doughy paunch beneath his expensive but poorly tailored shirt. He looked tired. He looked exactly like a man who had spent 9 years being managed by Gemma. Sorry, Gemma announced, kissing our mother's cheek. Liam couldn't figure out the valet, and you know how insane traffic is coming from the new house. The new house. A 4-bedroom colonial they couldn't afford, bought entirely to impress people who didn't care. They took the seats directly across from David and me. Liam gave me a tight, terrified nod. I took a slow sip of water. I didn't feel the panic I used to fear would consume me. I just felt a dull, hollow fatigue. The dinner dragged on, an agonizing parade of tiny, overpriced courses. Oysters resting in pools of gray ice water, slivers of duck breast that required entirely too much chewing. Gemma dominated the conversation, as was tradition. She talked loudly about their upcoming trip to Cabo, her new promotion at the PR firm, the renovations on the Colonial. Every anecdote was a subtle flex, a desperate bid to prove that she had won the prize. David sat quietly, eating his meal, occasionally offering a polite smile or a brief, perceptive comment that Gemma entirely talked over. She looked at him with barely disguised pity. To Gemma, a man who didn't brag was a man who had nothing to offer. By the time the sommelier poured the 3rd bottle of wine, a heavily oaked Chardonnay that coated the tongue like butter, Gemma's filter had completely dissolved. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table, bracelets clattering against the wood. Her eyes were slightly glassy, fixed on me. "So Harper," she drawled, a smirk playing at the corners of her glossed lips. "Mom tells me you're still at that boutique agency. And David, you fix chairs, right?" "I restore antique furniture," David said mildly, not taking the bait. He reached for his water glass, his movements unhurried. Gemma let out a short, sharp laugh. It was the same laugh she used when we were kids, right before she broke one of my toys on purpose. "That's so quaint," Gemma said, waving a hand dismissively. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with a toxic mix of alcohol and lifelong rivalry. "It's just so cute how you two are so comfortable. I mean, look at you. No ambition to scale, no desire for the big leagues, just scraping by in your little apartment. It's sweet, really. You always did settle for the simple things, Harper." The table went dead silent. Even the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to drop away. My mother cleared her throat, a frantic warning sound. "Gemma, let's just enjoy the wine." "No, I'm just saying." Gemma interrupted, her voice rising, cutting through the jazz playing overhead. She gestured toward Liam, who was staring fixedly at his empty plate, his jaw tight. Some of us have to carry the weight of real stress. Mortgages, portfolios, maintaining a lifestyle. You don't have to worry about any of that, Harper. You just exist. It must be so easy. She laughed again, a loud, grating, echoing sound that hung in the air above the wilted centerpieces. I sat there, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. 9 years ago, I would have shrunk into my chair. 5 years ago, I would have thrown my wine in her face. But as I looked at her, really looked at her, I saw the tight, frantic grip she had on the stem of her wine glass. I saw the way Liam leaned away from her, his body language screaming a silent, desperate desire to be anywhere else. I smelled the heavy, cloying vanilla of her perfume, and suddenly, it didn't smell like a threat anymore. It smelled like panic. I felt David's thumb brush against my knee under the table, a silent anchor, a reminder of the present. I placed my napkin gently on the table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You're right, Gemma," I said, my voice steady, cutting through her laughter like a knife through soft clay. "I don't have a mortgage on a house I hate, and I don't go to sleep every night wondering if my partner is plotting to leave me for someone closer to the kitchen." The silence that followed my words wasn't empty. It was thick, vibrating with the sudden, violent shift in barometric pressure that happens right before a storm breaks. Somewhere in the background, a waiter dropped a tray of cutlery. The stainless steel clattered against the slate floor, ringing out like a fire alarm, but nobody at our table flinched. I watched the blood drain from Gemma's face, leaving her heavy contouring looking like dirt smeared across a pale canvas. Her mouth opened slightly, a wet, sticky sound, but no words came out. She looked to Liam. It was an instinctual movement, a plea for backup, for him to jump in and defend her honor, to tell me I was insane, bitter, and pathetic. Liam didn't look at her. He kept his eyes pinned to the table, staring at a ring of condensation left by his water glass. He swallowed hard. A single bead of sweat broke out at his hairline, catching the dim overhead lighting. In that microscopic hesitation, in his absolute, cowardly refusal to meet his wife's eyes, he confirmed everything I had just said. He confirmed every suspicion Gemma harbored in the dark, quiet hours of her expensive, suffocating life. My mother was the first to break the vacuum. "Harper," she hissed, her voice trembling with the rigid, terrifying propriety of a woman who cared more about the optics of a restaurant dinner than the emotional wreckage of her children. "That is entirely uncalled for. You apologize to your sister right now." I looked at my mother. I saw the tight lines around her mouth, the desperate, pleading look in her eyes, begging me to maintain the fiction we had all agreed upon 9 years ago. Be the strong one. Swallow it down. "No," I said. It wasn't a shout, it was just a fact. I felt David shift beside me. He didn't say a word, but he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his wallet, and dropped 3 crisp $100 bills onto the center of the table. They landed next to the wilted floral centerpiece with a soft, dismissive thud. It was more than enough to cover our overpriced duck and the pretentious wine. "Happy anniversary, Helen." "Richard," David said, his voice calm, carrying a steady resonance that made Liam flinch. He stood up, sliding his chair back over the hardwood floor. He didn't look at Gemma or Liam. He just offered his hand to me. I took it. His skin was rough, calloused from years of sanding oak and working chisels, but it was incredibly warm. We walked out of the restaurant without looking back. I didn't storm out. I didn't march. I walked at a perfectly normal pace, weaving past the crowded tables smelling of roasted garlic, spilled gin, and expensive perfumes. When the heavy glass doors of Times swung shut behind us, the biting November wind hit my face like a wet towel. The city was loud, a siren wailing 3 blocks away, the hiss of bus brakes, the low hum of streetlights. I stood on the pavement, the cold seeping through the thin fabric of my trousers, and took my first real breath of the evening. It tasted like exhaust fumes and impending snow. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. I expected my hands to shake. I expected the adrenaline crash to hit me, bringing tears or guilt or some messy combination of both. But as I stood there on the curb waiting for the valet, I just felt empty, a good empty. The kind of empty you feel when you finally drag a heavy, rotting piece of furniture out to the curb for the trash collectors. David wrapped his arm around my shoulders, pulling me into the heavy wool of his peacoat. It smelled of sawdust and the faint, minty tang of his shaving cream. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his breath forming a white cloud in the freezing air. "I think so," I said, leaning my weight into him. "It was a good exit," he noted, a faint smile playing at the corners of his eyes. "Though I think your mom might genuinely try to bill us for the emotional damages." I let out a short, surprised laugh that turned into a cough. "I'm sorry about the money. That was a lot of cash to drop on a terrible meal." David shrugged, handing his ticket to the shivering valet. "Consider it an eviction fee. We just moved them out of your head for good." The ride home was quiet. We didn't dissect the evening. We didn't need to. The streetlights flickered rhythmically across the dashboard of David's beat-up Subaru, painting shadows across his knuckles as he gripped the steering wheel. I watched the city blur past the passenger window, realizing that for the first time in nearly a decade, I wasn't wondering what Liam and Gemma were doing. I didn't care if they were screaming at each other in the Uber ride back to their colonial. I didn't care if Liam was sleeping in the guest room. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, a cage they had stolen from me, assuming it was a castle. The true punchline of the whole ordeal didn't arrive until 3 weeks later. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and a miserable sleet was coming down, turning the city streets into a gray, slushy soup. I had taken the afternoon off from the agency to help David at his workshop. He was restoring a mid-century teak credenza, and I was on hinge polishing duty, a mindless, repetitive task involving brass cleaner and steel wool that I actually found deeply therapeutic. The shop was a sensory haven. It was heated by an ancient, rattling cast-iron stove in the corner that radiated a dry, intense warmth. The air was thick with the scent of boiled linseed oil, aged wood, and the metallic tang of sharpening stones. Dust motes danced heavily in the fluorescent light suspended over the main workbench. I was scrubbing a particularly stubborn patch of oxidation off a brass bracket when the bell above the front door jingled, a harsh, tinny sound that broke the rhythmic scrape of David's sandpaper. A gust of freezing, wet air blew into the shop. I looked up, wiping my blackened hands on a grease rag. Liam stood in the doorway. He looked terrible. The collar of his wool trench coat was turned up against the cold, but his hair was plastered to his forehead by the sleet. He was shivering, his shoes leaving dark, muddy puddles on the scarred hardwood floor. His eyes darted around the shop, taking in the stacked lumber, the pegboards of tools, and finally, me. David stopped sanding. He didn't put his block down. He just straightened up, wiping a fine layer of white dust from his jeans, his expression settling into a rigid, unreadable mask. "Liam," David said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of a pest. Liam swallowed, pulling his hands out of his pockets. He looked smaller than he had at the restaurant, stripped of the dim lighting and the expensive wine. He just looked like a middle-aged man who hadn't slept in a week. "Harper, David," Liam muttered, his voice raspy. He took a hesitant step forward, stopping when David subtly shifted his weight. I looked up your shop address online. I hope you don't mind." "We do," David said flatly. Liam flinched, but he turned his focus to me. The desperation rolling off him was palpable. It smelled like stale coffee and nervous sweat, cutting through the pleasant aroma of the linseed oil. "Harper, please. Just 5 minutes," he pleaded, taking a step toward my workbench. I didn't move. I kept the brass hinge in my left hand, the blackened rag in my right. "There is absolutely nothing you have to say that I want to hear, Liam. You need to leave." "Gemma kicked me out," he blurted, the words tumbling over each other in a rush to escape his mouth. His eyes were wide, glassy. 3 days ago, after the anniversary dinner, she lost her mind. She went through my phone, my emails, everything. She's filing for divorce. She's keeping the house. I'm staying at a Motel 6 out by the interstate. I stared at him. I waited for the surge of triumph. I waited for the petty, vindictive joy that I had fantasized about in my mid-20s, when I used to lie awake imagining his life falling apart. It didn't come. All I felt was a profound, suffocating, secondhand embarrassment. "Why are you here, Liam?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Did you think I was going to make you a cup of tea? Did you think I was going to pat your hand and tell you it's going to be okay?" No, I just..." He ran a trembling hand through his wet hair, leaving it standing on end. He looked around the shop again, as if the answers were written on the exposed brick walls. I just needed to talk to someone who understands, someone who knows how she is. You know how she gets, Harper. She suffocates you. She spends money we don't have. She demands constant attention, and if you step out of line for 1 second, she destroys you. He was doing it again. I watched the frantic movement of his hands, the pathetic slump of his shoulders, and I saw the exact same man I had caught in my kitchen 9 years ago. He hadn't changed. He hadn't learned a single thing. When things got hard, when his own choices cornered him, his instinct was to find the nearest woman to manage his guilt and absorb his consequences. 9 years ago, he used Gemma to escape the mundane reality of our relationship. Now, he was trying to use me to escape the monstrous reality he had built with her. You chose her, Liam, I said. My voice was steady, void of any anger. It was the tone you used to explain basic math to a child. You sat at my kitchen table, in the apartment I paid the deposit on, and you chose the suffocation. You wanted the excitement. You wanted the drama. I made a mistake, he yelled suddenly, his voice cracking, echoing off the high tin ceiling of the shop. I was an idiot. We were good together, Harper. We were safe. I threw away my whole life for a goddamn perfume counter illusion, and now I have nothing. He took another step forward, reaching a hand out toward the edge of my workbench. Please, Harp. I don't know what to do. David moved. It wasn't fast, but it was absolute. He stepped out from behind his credenza, interposing himself entirely between Liam and my workbench. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't puff out his chest. He just stood there, a solid wall of muscle, flannel, and quiet menace. She told you to leave, David said. The gravel in his voice had hardened into concrete. You don't get to come in here and bleed your mess all over my floor. Turn around. Walk out the door. If I have to ask you again, I'm not going to use my words. Liam froze. He looked at David's forearms, dusted with sawdust, and then up to David's eyes. Whatever Liam saw there made the last remnants of his pathetic bravado evaporate. He shrank back, his hands retreating to his coat pockets. He looked at me over David's shoulder. Harper. Goodbye, Liam, I said. I picked up my piece of steel wool and went back to scrubbing the brass hinge. I didn't watch him leave. I heard the heavy, shuffling footsteps. I heard the tinny jingle of the bell. I heard the door click shut, rattling in its frame against the winter wind outside. David stood still for a long moment, watching the street through the frosted front window. Then, he let out a long, slow exhale. He walked back to his credenza, picked up his sanding block, and resumed his work. The rhythmic, abrasive sound filled the shop once again, steady and predictable. I looked down at the hinge in my hand. Beneath the years of grime, beneath the tarnish and the neglect, the brass was finally starting to shine. It wasn't a bright, blinding gold. It was a deep, muted luster. The kind of shine that only comes from friction, time, and deliberate effort. You missed a spot on the corner, David murmured, not looking up from his wood. I'll get it, I replied. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just dipped my rag back into the cleaner, breathed in the smell of the sawdust and the hot iron stove, and went back to work. There were no fireworks, no grand speeches of closure, just the quiet, absolute certainty that my life belonged to me. The rot had finally been cut out, the joints re-glued, the foundation secured. I survived the ash, and I built something out of the wood. Enjoyed this story? The best revenge isn't dramatic, it's building a beautiful life they can no longer touch. If Harper's journey from heartbreak to quiet victory resonated with you, hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that walking away is sometimes the biggest win. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss out on more deep, grounded, healing stories. What would you have said at that dinner table? Let me know in the comments below.